Hello everybody, thanks for coming out one more time. Our content objective is that various approaches to harvesting timber, basically cutting down trees, are going to have a different impact on different ecosystems. So it kind of depends on the ecosystem we're talking about. Different ones react differently, largely because of their soil types and the climate. And the reason this is important is because we all like wood, and we're probably all sitting in wood structures right now, and wood is a renewable resource, but it's a resource that needs to be managed. And so this is where the science of forestry comes in. How do we minimize our impact, and how do we find a sustainable yield? And I'm not going to have answers to all of those questions, but we'll just take a little survey of some things we got to think about when we're taking wood. So I've got a bunch of slides for you. This is the first one, and I ask you, is this really a forest? Remembering that a forest is a diverse, complicated ecosystem with interacting parts and matter cycling and energies flowing and so forth. This is, if you look, it's like all these trees are the same, they're the same age, they're in rows. There might be a little wildlife, and there's definitely some interaction going on there, but this is not a forest. This is a tree farm, right? And there can be a spot for a tree farm too. But when we're talking about forests, it's like a whole different thing, and it's important to realize that we really have lost the vast majority of primary forests. And we see forests out there, but their primary forests are kind of special because they're old growth forests. And so think of like those redwood groves with just the huge trees. But those can happen for other trees too. They might not be as big, but they can be old and mature forests that has very little impact. So it's just, this is pre-Columbus, and they say a squirrel could go from Maine all the way to Oklahoma or wherever without ever putting its feet down on the ground once. It could just go from tree to tree. And that's clearly not the case anymore. And so the other thing to see is that we've got these little islands here, right? And so remember the island effect. And the islands can be few and far between too, so little diversity hotspots. But if we need to keep this in mind when we start thinking about, a lot of people really want to see the tropical rainforests, the deforestation slow down, and it's hard for us up here in the United States to offer them advice considering what we've done to our old growth forests. And so it's just a kind of a tough spot to be in, but one we need to recognize. So I've got some Cornell notes for you. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to go through three major types of forest here and look at two different ways of taking timber. One is clear cutting, and one is what's called a selective cut. And then we'll look at a few other impacts that you can have with that. And I've got a couple stories for you too. And so here we go. Forest type number one, Western United States. We can call it a coniferous forest, or coniferous, I think is the word. It's a forest of conifer trees. And what a conifer is basically a tree with needles. And you might think of pine trees. There's some other ones that aren't pine trees, but pine trees are conifers. And interesting to note that those needles are actually leaves. It's an evolutionary adaptation for it to save water. And that's a good thing for it to have out in the West because it's so dry out here. And so you tend to have really kind of thinner soils, a little bit acidic soils, and dry. And so these trees have pretty deep root systems because they've got to tap water from way down to survive these long, hot summers. And so we've got conifers in the East Coast too, and in the southeast of the United States, and it's a little bit different there. Just to zip back here, this is a boreal biome, or a taiga biome. Over here, it's a different type of biome, and it's more of a mixed hardwood forest. And so it's got deciduous trees, but it's also got the conifers too. And I got another slide here as well. And the deciduous trees, remember, are the ones that drop their leaves. We've got some in California, but we forget that they drop their leaves. But this is like, in Minnesota, this is what it's starting to look like. Or anywhere in the East Coast, it's like fall hits, Indian summer, really pretty. Leaves drop, which is actually also an evolutionary adaptation to conserve water. But once the leaves drop, they just don't look quite as pretty. But the trees slow way down. But anyway, also a mixed forest here, okay? And so, but the difference is here, if you were to cut down trees, which we do, if you cut down a tree and plant a new one, you can come back and get that new one in 100 years. It's a 100-year cycle for regrowth. Versus up here on the East Coast or Southeast, it's a 50-year cycle. And so you can grow trees twice as fast. So, and that's largely because of the soil and the climate. But so the really good regrowth there. And so I've got a little story, and I know you guys love hearing stories about me. And so here's how it goes. Once upon a time, right when I just got out of college, as you know, I was working for the Forest Service. I had a few different gigs. I was here in Idaho, and then I was in Lake Tahoe for a while too, doing the spotted. I was on a spotted owl crew, and then we got laid off. And they asked us if we wanted to get rehired, but the deal was is we had to get ourselves all the way over here to Maine. And so we did it, my buddy and I. And so we had a fun adventure. We went and explored Maine, whole different culture, different world out there. Go hang out with the Mainers for a while. But it was a really good experience, and what our job was, it was totally different than what we were doing in Tahoe. Our job was, we were on we were called timber cruisers, and we were to go out and do forest inventory analysis. And our whole thing was like we were basically keeping track of America's timber reserves. And so here's what they do. It was totally random. Every day we'd get a new picture. It looked like this, an aerial shot from an airplane. And it would literally have a pinhole of light in the picture. And we'd have to go find that pinhole on the ground. So just pretend like at the end of my arrow there's a pinhole. And so what we do is we'd find that road on the ground, and we'd find that little curve there, and we'd kind of like find a reference point, and then we'd use compasses, like 0 degrees north, and chains, which are 100-yard long ropes, and you'd work with a person and you'd line each other up in the compass, and we'd march out to that spot, and then we'd turn at 13 degrees, and we'd like we'd basically bushwhack through the forest to find plot center, that pinhole of light. And then we'd start digging, and we'd dig through the duff and the leaves, and you'd find a dowel rod that somebody had banged into the ground to mark plot center like 15 years ago, 30 years ago, sometimes 75. And we'd keep coming back every 15 years to do an analysis of the area. And we'd go from 0 degrees north, 53.6 feet out exactly, go all the way around in a circle, count all the trees, measure them, take core samples, soil samples, all this stuff. And so really kind of a random type of work, but people are doing it all across the United States and Alaska. It's actually very expensive, but just recognizing that our timber reserves are a really valuable resource, and it really kind of a point of national security. But so one of the things that struck me when I got out there is how much clear cutting's going on. So here's the thing, in Maine, 2/3 of the state is owned by the paper companies, and so this is not a tragedy of the commons. This is them doing what they do. And of course, I was coming out of college, I was shocked to see these clear cuts, but I tried to keep an open mind and learn something, which was a good call for me to do at the time. But so clear cutting, it can be pretty dramatic to look at. But the thing to recognize here, or at least what I recognized right away, because we were hiking through this stuff, is how thick it would come back. It just, look at how green that is here. And so this is just, from a year or two earlier, it just comes back twice as thick. Here it is a little bit more advanced. You can see the baby trees coming out. And if you remember, deer and moose and elk too, for that matter, are all browsers, and they love these trees coming up. And so here's a deer. We see a ton of wildlife when we were doing our work. These deer are in there munching up the trees, and look at how thick that is. And we'd have to just hack our way through it. It was really something to see, and it was an eye-opener, because out here in the West, clear cutting is just like something you really don't want to do. I mean, we used to say it mimics fire, and now we know better. Really, that's not a very strong argument based on what we know now, like tea kettle experiment. But so out here, this doesn't recover so fast, right? It's a really dry soil. And the rain can come and wash it away, and now you got soil erosion. It takes 1,000 years about to replace an inch of topsoil. It's a very precious resource. Now it's in the creek, and it causes it to get all muddy and murky, and it blocks light and causes water quality problems in the creek. It also creates, it fragments the habitat, and you get this nice little edge effect here. And so you got all this weird stuff coming on. We'll talk more about edge effects another day, but it's just not as conducive to doing a clear cut out here. And I don't mean to justify the clear cut in Maine. It was just an eye-opener, and I'm just pointing out it's a different ecosystem there, right? So anymore, and again, it's not a tragedy of the commons, right? It's private land. This is just what they do. And so kind of interesting, the lumberjacks, when they're not cutting down trees, they're hunting. And so it's a win-win for these guys. And so anymore what we do out in the West, I'm looking for my next slide here. Here it is. This is called selective cutting. And what that means is you go in and you're not going to mow down the whole forest. You're just going to choose certain trees to cut. And so if you go through a national forest or somewhere where they're doing this, you'll see the forest is they've thinned out the forest, right? And this was also an argument for fire management, right? Thin out the forest. If there hasn't been a fire there, thin it out so there's not as much to burn. But you can see these stumps here, stump here, stump here, and that's also a great spot for forestry. And so we don't really hear about people majoring in forestry out here on the West Coast, but it's a major. People study it in college all the time. Gifford Pinchot, for example. But really, it becomes like, so what trees do you take? How do you do this to minimize your impact? Do you take the biggest tree or the medium-sized tree? Do you take the dead trees? Here's a snag. That's a dead tree. Here's another snag. Do you take that thing out? Some people would say yes, definitely, because that wood's just going to rot. It's going to go to waste. It's a fire hazard. And other people would say, well, maybe maybe that's valuable habitat and it's holding the soil in the ground, or there's just different ways to look at it, and there's a whole science behind it too. But one thing to recognize is even when you're just taking a little bit, there's still an impact. You still got to get that wood out of there. You still need roads. You still need heavy machinery. You still have you're still leaving a lot of wood on the ground, like the smaller branches. Now it's dead wood, which is a fire hazard. And so you've got impacts even when you're trying to go low impact, you're still going to have impacts. And so here's where we are. We've talked about western forests, eastern, southeastern forest. And by the way, those deciduous trees are like oak, maple, cherry trees, oak again. And so now what I want to do is take you to the third forest. And that third forest is going to be in the Amazon rainforest. Where's my slide? It's a tropical rainforest. And what you end up getting is it's a whole different type of ecosystem, right? It's much more diverse. And so you got all different types of trees, which makes it hard to log because loggers want certain trees. And so now you got all these different types of trees. You guys have heard of mahogany. It's a really nice wood. They make a lot of instruments, including guitars. Here's one mahogany tree, and you got a few acres. You got the one really, they call it exotic wood up here, and people will pay high dollar for it too. And you really want to be careful about where that wood came from, because one thing we don't want to be doing is supporting the destruction of the Amazon or any tropical forest. Because what happens is a lot of the times you have clear cutting happening here, but the difference down here is the soil is so thin. The vast majority of nutrients in a forest, in the Amazon or any tropical rainforest, is stored up here in the biomass above ground. And so the trees have really shallow root systems. When you take them down, you get massive erosion. That just thin soil erodes away, and it leaves underneath it a layer of clay, and that soil doesn't come back. That doesn't get regrown. And so that's one of the big fears around the Amazon. And so look at this, just how eroded out that is. And that can cause problems in the river too. And so these are things to think about, but again, it's like it's hard for us to tell them how to do their thing when we've done what we've done to ours. I think we need to basically wrap this up. I'm going to come back here. I hope you guys can do a summary on this, and I think we addressed all these things about trying to minimize islands and all these kind of things. But we're going to wrap it up for now. Be sure to fill out the Google form. I hope you found this interesting on some level. Let me know if you've got questions, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, you guys.